My name's Adam Landau. I've been going to air shows since I was 6 or 7 years old, but since 2018 I've been on what I term the interesting side of the crowd line fence, working as ground crew at about 24 air shows all around the world. And one of the things I've enjoyed most about that is the chance to sit down and have really lengthy, detailed, intelligent conversations with airshow pilots and organisers and ask all the questions that you just can't find the answers to in any other way. So what I'd like to do with this mini-series, Airshows Uncovered, is to share some of those conversations with you. Now, this first discussion is one that I had back in June 2020 at the height of lockdown with Bob Grimstead, the airshow pilot, former airline captain and aviation journalist, and we talked in enormous detail about the display sequence, how you design it, how you validate it, and to what extent it's acceptable to change things up on the fly. It was absolutely fascinating, but I started off by asking Bob how he got into airshows in the 1980s. Enjoy.
When I started in the 80s, I was a professional pilot. I had been a professional pilot for, I think, 11 years. And then my fleet that I flew was wound up, closed down. And I faced the prospect of not flying for a significant period. I had some income, but I wanted to stay in flying practice. I was a member of the Tiger Club. So one Saturday lunchtime, I was in the clubhouse in the tea room, and I said to the assembled people, "Can anybody help me stay in practice with my flying while I'm stood down?" And Neil Thomason, who was the leader of the Turb team at that time, the turbulent team, the Tiger Club's turbulent display team, said, "Go and check out information flying in the turbulent. It won't cost you a lot of money. And then we'll have you on the turbulent team this year." And I was assessed by Brian Smith, who was, I can't remember whether Pete Kinsey or Brian Smith was the chief pilot then, but those guys were all, they would be watching everything we did all the time. And we did a formal assessment to show that our sequence was acceptable and we were all acceptable pilots within the team. We had to do a little bit of recovering from problems that developed during the display and show that we could do that. And then off we went, and we did our first season's displaying. That was 1982, and I flew with the Turb team for 5 years, I think, subsequently, and became leader 2 years later.
And that process you just described was effectively the Turb team's equivalent to a display authorization, given there was no official DA system in the UK at that stage.
Yes, it was in fact the Tiger Club's process. The Tiger Club, which still is Britain's foremost sporting flying club, had organised displays for 25 years prior to that, and they had a very good system in place which required any display pilot to be assessed by the senior members of the display committee in the club and to prove that they could recover from any cock-ups that might happen during the sequence. Once you were assessed as adequate, obviously people kept an eye on you the first couple of years anyway. The leader would keep an eye on each individual team member, but it wasn't formalised and it wasn't a regular reassessment as it is now. In about 84 or 85, the CAA brought in, or Barry Tempest, who was in that role in the CAA at that time, brought in the display authorization process. We all got grandfather rights as display pilots, but then thereafter, every year we had to renew our display authorization every 13 months strictly, and be assessed. And it depends who your display authorization evaluator is. Different. I've flown for probably 10 different CAAs in Britain now. Some are go into much more detail than others. Some will ask you simply to fly your sequence. And quite often, of course, they will have seen you flying. They're all active display pilots. They will see you flying on the circuit. But they'll ask you to formally fly your sequence for them and either approve it or make suggestions as to what you ought to do to change your sequence in order to be able to approve you later. I've flown with some DAEs who will spend all day discussing every maneuver in your sequence, how they follow from one on to another, why you've chosen to put the maneuvers, why you've chosen to use the maneuvers in the first place, and why you've chosen to put them in that order, and what would you do if this happened here or that happened there. And then they'll often get you to fly your primary sequence and then perhaps get you to fly your poor weather sequence, or get you to amend your sequence as though spectators had moved into an area of the airfield over which you could not then fly, therefore limiting your display area. And, you know, they're trying to persuade you at some stage to make the decision, no, I have to stop my sequence now, I have to stop my display now, which is something I've done in real life on a couple of occasions in the displays for one reason or another.
And presumably to make that judgment call in the heat of the moment about whether you do take a safety decision to knock it off or whether you continue in the name of showmanship, do you have to be a particular sort of personality in order to make that work and make the right call every time?
I think you do. You can't expect, we're human beings and we would like to make the right call every time. You don't always make the right call every time. That's an aspect of being a human being. It's part of what we call human factors in aviation. You've got to accept that there is tremendous pressure from within oneself to display on a day and at a time that you've said you will display, despite the fact that you might have a minor unserviceability in your airplane, despite the weather might be worse than you would like it to be. Many display pilots, I think probably 80% of display pilots in Britain are professional pilots anyway. We're well used to saying, I'm sorry, but no. I started attending air displays when I was 15 or 16 in the mid-1960s. There were a lot of ex-Air Force people flying in the displays in the 60s. In fact, many of the commercial pilots I worked with were also ex-Air Force. So they had that self-discipline, that responsible attitude to their display flying. But there has always been an element of pilots in the display world who are wealthy men who have built up their wealth by not following social norms, not following the beaten track of the herd, and they can then go away and afford to buy themselves an interesting and exciting and possibly high performance airplane and want to get onto the display circuit. And the personality traits that have enabled them to make a lot of money by working outside normal rules are not necessarily the right personality traits we would like to see of a display pilot. So either they have to relearn new behaviour, or they find themselves not getting a display authorization.
At the point where display authorizations were introduced, did that generate a bit of a culture clash between people who'd been doing it their way and nobody had been stopping them, and suddenly the CAA are there telling them that there's minimum altitudes and they need to get approval for their routine? And did that cause any problems when some of these regulations first started coming into force?
We applauded it. There had been a lot of accidents in the early and mid 80s. A lot of people have been killed. Generally, if there's a display accident, you don't survive it. You're very lucky if you get away with a crash in the display world. And so we all felt there was a need for change. Up until then, one of the situations had been with no lower limit on people's display flying. Each successive pilot at a show would tend to fly a little bit lower than the bloke before him and push the boundaries a little bit more than the guy before him. And that's a human nature development, part of human factors, as we call it in commercial aviation now. And by imposing a minimum height on every pilot, we've all got their own, they're individual, and imposing a minimum distance from the crowd on all pilots, and they're the same for all pilots in the same performance class of aeroplane. That helped tremendously in reducing the numbers of accidents and the numbers of, there were scares, there were near misses, there were close calls as well, and all of those were reduced. So as far as I know, I never met a pilot who didn't approve of the introduction of display authorization. I know that almost every pilot in the display world in Britain doesn't approve of the huge legislative changes that have taken place in the last 4 or 5 years since the Shoreham accident, because most of those are bureaucratic impositions and they don't improve safety at all. One of the things that has been imposed on us is that we have to fly further away from the crowd, where in 50 years, no pilot had ever hit the crowd. There was no need for pilots to fly further away from the crowd. They are now flying closer to people who are not paying spectators, people who are not involved in the air show and know the risks they're undertaking. That's just daft. Unfortunately, you cannot complain about it because the CAA then says you don't have the right attitude for being a display pilot and will snatch your DA, will suspend your DA.
I'd like to talk about how you develop your display routine and how peer review plays into that, and how the advice of your DAE might play into that, and also your own practice. But before you get to the point of actually getting into the aeroplane, what are some of the factors you might think through, some of the planning that you might be doing when you're devising your display routine in the very early stages of preparation?
I know that each maneuver in my airplane takes about 15 seconds. My smokes burn for 4 minutes, therefore I need about 16 maneuvers or figures to make up a sequence. So I'd get 20 or so post-its and I'd write on each post-it a maneuver, stall turn, horizontal roll, quarter clover, whatever I felt that I could safely fly. Something that I've flown many, many times that I felt completely comfortable with. And then I would lay them out on a piece of paper. So you come in with a figure, you do a turnaround, do another figure, another turnaround, another figure, another turnaround. So of your 16 figures, you need basically 6 or 7 to do in front of the crowd and 6 or 7 that give you turnaround capability. And I put these on a piece of paper, lay the post-its on a piece of paper, and then look and see notation to see whether they wandered off the piece of paper on one side or the other. And it's important with an airplane like mine, particularly, which is quite slow, but in any airplane, if you're flying along the crowd line for 4 minutes and you've got a 15-knot wind, that 15-knot wind will displace you 1 mile, and they can't see you when you're a mile away. So I write a sequence in which generally I have 2 figures going into wind and then 1 figure going downwind, or perhaps no figure at all going downwind, and a turnaround, 2 figures going into wind, 1 figure downwind, so that my sequence, without me having to make any adjustments on the day, so that my sequence stays in front of the crowd in a 15-knot wind. If the wind is more than 15 knots, then I have to work into wind more. If the wind is less than 15 knots, then I will probably add a downwind sequence, or I might add an into wind sequence if it's a stronger wind or whatever. So I have a sequence card, and usually on my sequence card, some figures are drawn in felt tip pen, fine felt tip pen. Some figures are drawn in biro, so those are, if you like, figures I can remove if I need to, and some figures might be drawn in pencil. And those I can see at a glance when I'm flying my sequence are places where I've given myself the opportunity of working into wind or working away from the crowd and so on. And then when I started off, I would just limit myself to 14 or 16 simple figures going up and down the crowd line. Later on, within a year or two, I realized that certain figures, like a stall turn particularly, looks good in plan view to the crowd with the stripy upper surface to your airplane. If you do a stall turn in the distance, it looks nice. So I then put in figures that would take me out on the B-axis, so away from the crowd, and bring me back again with a stall turn in the distance. And each year I try and vary my sequence as well, just for my own mental acuity. I get bored flying the same sequence. If I do 12 displays in a season, I will have flown that sequence probably 100 times that year. And I just get bored with it. And I want a challenge, so I'll maybe over the years, as I have found myself capable of flying more difficult figures in my airplane, I've put in more complex figures into my sequence. Now I've got to the stage where I think I can fly everything that can possibly be flown in my airplane. I've actually had to take some out, thanks to our darling CAA. I used to fly a rolling circle. I can happily fly a rolling circle rolling inwards. It's a very easy maneuver in my airplane, but somebody in the CAA has decided that rolling circles rolling inwards are just as difficult as rolling circles rolling outwards, and nominated them to be advanced maneuvers, and I only have an intermediate level display authorization, so I cannot now fly a rolling circle or even a quarter. Yep.
And if you were to get some feedback in the middle of a display season, and a number of people said they weren't quite convinced that one particular part of the display worked, but you'd already got your DA, you'd been watched by a DAE, you'd practiced for countless hours, would you still be prepared to change things up mid-season? And how much is it wise to change things up mid-season?
That's a very good question. It's a particularly insightful question, Adam, because it depends. If I was told on a Saturday that part of my sequence was lacking in some way, didn't have enough showmanship, or there was a risk in it, and I was flying on the Sunday, then I may well just remove that bit of my sequence from the sequence and fly the sequence on the Sunday shorter, missing the dodgy bit. If I was flying the next weekend, I might experiment during the week with a modified sequence, but the following weekend, depending on how that experimentation went, I might fly the original sequence, but with the removed portion. I wouldn't fly a new sequence or a significantly revised sequence until I was certain I could do it 100% every time. And that brings me on to another issue. Some display venues, Old Warden is one that springs to mind, have not one display axis, but two. So one would modify one's display in advance for that venue, but you would practice and practice and practice in the weeks prior. You do not ever just change your display sequence on the hoof. And if when you get to a venue, you find it's got a right angle in the display line or a 45-degree angle in the display line, and you hadn't known that, and you should know that, you don't change your sequence. You just accept that you have to fly the sequence that you've practiced rather than trying to make up something on the spot. I'm a very conservative display pilot. Probably other pilots don't feel the same way. The whole point of what we do in display flying is to entertain the public and make the public pro aviation. And anything that creates a risk, anything that makes the crowd suck in their breaths for a moment or frightens anybody is absolutely undoing all the good work everybody else has done. So you must be sure that never happens.
So along similar lines, if you are already in the middle of a display and the wind is doing something you don't quite expect, or maybe there's some low cloud in a particular place, or there might be something else unforeseen that crops up, to what extent can you modify your plan mid-display? Because there's going to be some circumstances, surely, where you just have to.
Yes, I have done that. If I lose more height than I expected because it's more turbulent and I'm putting in more control inputs, which increases the drag, which means I lose height. If it's hotter than I anticipated, and I have a little grid that I refer to, depending on the temperature, I start higher if it's a hot day. But if my calculations didn't work out, and if I find myself getting low, for instance, I would just fly a 360-degree turn or a series of 360-degree turns while I climb back up to get more height. I've done that on a number of occasions in the past, and I should continue to do it. One day I had a performance shortfall in my engine one day, so I had to fly a much more conservative sequence than I'd expected to fly, and I told the flying display director and the flight control committee what was happening, and that I was down on power and that I might have to land, and they were all prepared for that. I was able to continue with simple manoeuvres, none of the complex ones.
Was that the Midlands Air Festival Sunday 2018?
It was, yes.
How is that compatible with needing to submit a sequence card, for instance?
Everybody knows, and the civil aviation document which applies acknowledges that although you submit a sequence card, you may have to modify it on the date. And I don't remember the actual wording they use, but they say in view of prevailing circumstances, it might require modification. We all understand that. Everybody in the display circuit understands that. There may be a number of reasons why you need to modify your display, but don't have to stop it. And it's It's a decision jointly made. I made the decision on that occasion to fly very simple maneuvers, and you were there, you'll remember I climbed up higher than I normally fly. I flew higher and more gently than I usually do.
And the last thing I'd like to ask you about today is really how you went from flying a solo display in your Fournier, starting in, what, about 2008, to then doing a duo a couple of years later. What were some of the considerations that you had to think about when you were adding a second aeroplane, coming up with a new routine? Was it like starting from square one all over again?
Very much so. It's a very insightful question again. Bear in mind that I'd flown not only formation flying, I'd flown formation in groups of up to 24 is the biggest formation I've flown in, but we used to fly tied together in threes in the turb team with our wings tied to one another, and I've flown turb team displays in formations of six. So I was very happy with formation flying. At the time I decided to go into formation aerobatic flying, I've been flying aerobatics for 40 years. I've been flying display aerobatics for 5 years. I thought it would be a mere formality to start flying formation aerobatics, partly because of the low power of our airplanes, partly because of the low drag of our airplanes, partly because of the fact that I was in my late 50s at the time. It took me a whole year to become competent. I was safe always because I would fly too far away, but it was a long time before we could put on, probably 2 years actually, before we put on a show that was interesting and that fulfilled our expectations of the sort of thing we wanted to do. It was much more difficult than I would ever have thought. And I say to anybody who's considering learning formation aerobatics, you need to be very, very good at aerobatics. You need to be very, very good at formation flying. And then you'll find it's very difficult to learn formation aerobatics. It really is a skill that takes some time to learn. Once learned, of course, you never lose it. You need to stay in practice if you're going to be any good at it. And I am very proud to say that I'm one of only 6 pilots worldwide that has ever flown formation display aerobatics in a Fournier RF4D. They are not the easiest airplane to do it in. I would love to be able to do another season of formation aerobatic display flying, or a couple, because I know I can improve on the standard I was at when we finished. And I think we did 5 years of it. We started with very, very simple maneuvers, and it was 2 or 3 formation, or 4 or 5 formation aerobatic maneuvers in trail as much as side by side, and then just some formation flying at the end because we knew we could do that, staying on our heads. And then bit by bit, as the seasons went on, we improved our formation aerobatics. I am certain that we could have been closer and we could have started lower and stayed lower now, knowing what I know now. But it was a process of learning about one another as people, learning about one another's aerobatic technique, and learning to match one another in our aeroplanes. And then bit by bit, we improved.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that just as much as I did. A huge thanks to Bob for his time. And also thanks to Plains TV, who provided that archive footage of Bob's 2-ship Red Hawks display from 2011, back before I had ever picked up a camera. Next time, we're going to be going from one of the oldest hands in the British Airshow circuit to one of the newest pilots to join it, Paul Freeland, who started displaying his SF260 Marchetti in 2019. I'm going to be asking Paul what inspired him to join the circuit at this incredibly difficult time for British Airshows, how he prepared for that in the age of display authorizations, and how he got a foothold in the industry in his very first season. Do subscribe so you can see that conversation when it comes along in hopefully a couple of months' time. But until then, thank you very much for joining me. It's goodbye for now.